Hi, welcome to another session in Environmental Economics Echo 310. This is the beginning of week 4, and I intend to do two brief videos. The first one, which is we're doing right now, is going to be a general background for the question of value. So our topic for this week is really going to be the chapter about value and the methodologies that are used by environmental economics, ecological economics, to go ahead and estimate the value of damage done to the environment whenever, which is normally the case, there is no market value for these damages. So in order to go ahead and discuss this chapter, the three methodologies, I'm going to leave them to deal with them separately in the second session. So right now what I want to do is just talk a little bit about the background to make sure that all of these ideas are very clear. Let me, by the way, take advantage of the fact that we are going to be talking about value and spend only 2 minutes to re-establish what is it that we've been doing. So we started by talking about the fact that environmental economists in particular are very critical of the mainstream economics based on their overall model, that's to say the circular flow, because it doesn't take into consideration the seminal role of nature and environment. Then we spoke about, obviously, the flaws in national income accounting. We spoke about the fact that the model that is based on the notion of efficiency as defined by Pareto, the Pareto optimality, that you shouldn't be able to grow in the present at the expense of the future, which has become really, in essence, the definition of economics, of sustainability. Which is really based on nothing else, as we said, but the idea of Pareto, because Pareto is saying that a particular allocation is efficient when any kind of a reallocation will benefit one by hurting the other. So in this case, make these two individuals the present and the future. If you're going to benefit the present at the expense of the future, then you really shouldn't do it. It means that you are already efficient. But if you're going to benefit the present at the expense of the future, then obviously something is wrong, because you are really violating the principle of efficiency. So that led us to believe, if you still recall, that yes, that model that we always speak about, that has been our guiding force forever and probably will be for the rest of our lives, has a great big flaw, because it is based on a theoretical construct that does not exist. In the reality of the world, we have a multiplicity of market failures. Now, how do we correct for these market failures? As we said, that we have to go ahead and apply either taxes or subsidies or interfere and introduce regulation. But in each of these cases, we are assuming that you know how to measure that particular damage in order to take certain steps to get back to that optimum point of efficiency. And keep in mind, by the way, what we did last time was to show that it isn't only in the static model that one can speak about a potential market failure, but even in the dynamic model. We found out that in a dynamic model, even if one is to assume efficiency, then efficiency does not lead to sustainability, because we would be in violation. So in all cases, no matter what you do, we've got to go ahead and measure certain things that do not have a market. We've got to value these things. And how do we value them? We value them in money terms. We've got to monetize in order to be able to take that corrective action. Which is what is it we're talking about right now in this chapter. So, okay, we have to undertake certain measures, and we've got to go ahead and find these values, but there are no markets for these values, so what do we do? Well, the easy thing, and this is what we're going to be doing, this is what we do most of the time, is that we assume that value is the same thing as the market, as the price. I want to take right now just a couple of moments to show you that value, or at least to speak to you about the notion that value is not necessarily the price. I mean, even from the time of Smith and Ricardo, as you can see from here, I wanted to just jot them down so that you'll be able to see them. Smith and Ricardo spoke of something that is known as the labor theory. That's to say, the value depends on the amount of labor that is embodied in that particular commodity. And this is not really something that is revolutionary, because you'll find out that the two single most important people in establishing modern economics, both Smith and Ricardo, spoke about this idea of the labor theory of value. That's to say, they were really, in essence, and in particular Ricardo died while he was still working on a paper trying to speak about the notion of an absolute value. That's to say, for every is, there is an isness. So for every chair, there is a chairness. So what is the isness of that particular item? Is there an absolute value to it? Or is it the price? The price, the price of an item is maybe $10 today and $15 tomorrow and $20 the day after. So how can the value of a particular item keep on fluctuating? Well, one easy answer, obviously, is to say that really it is the money, the unit in which we express that particular price that is fluctuating, but not the value itself. That's to say, the dollar itself will go up and down. And that's why one house that in the Westchester area that used to sell, let's assume, for $70,000 30 years ago, is selling right now for $700,000. It's exactly the same house. So it isn't the value of the house that has really increased tenfolds. In this particular case, one can argue that it is the purchasing power of the dollar in which we are expressing the value of the house that has come down. But in order to try and overcome this, the labor theory of value says every single item is determined by the value that is embodied in it. And one of the most important and common phrases used by Smith is that when he spoke about how is it that the rate of exchange between deer and beaver depends on how long does it take to go ahead and catch a deer vis-a-vis how long does it take to go ahead and hunt a beaver, provided that you assume that the same level of skill is going to be used and the same amount of capital is going to be used. So given the same capital and the same skill, if it takes you, let's assume, 5 hours to hunt a deer, and it takes you only 1 hour to hunt a beaver, then the rate of exchange is going to be 5 beavers to 1 deer. Why? Because of the labor that it took in order to provide each of these things. And there are many economists up until now, in the year 2017, I shouldn't say many, but there are a few economists who really believe that the actual exchange value of most commodities is actually determined by the amount of labor that is embodied in these commodities. But right now it is much more difficult to go ahead and do these calculations because we have machines that are producing machines. But each machine at one time had some labor embodied in it. So if you use a machine, you can find out how much labor was used in that machine for the production of another machine in order to calculate the amount of labor that it took in order to produce, say, for example, a car. Now, the same notion, labor theory of value, is crucial, is critical for the international trade theory of Ricardo. And we all know, I hope, that international trade is essentially nothing else but a Ricardian model. If you are to remove the labor theory of value from the assumptions of Ricardo, then the model falls apart. So the model again assumes that value is determined by the amount of labor that is in it. I can go even a little bit further by assuming that when we make international comparisons these days, many of you have heard of the term PPP. That's to say, if you have a particular country whereby the per capita income, say, is $10,000, and you have another country whereby the per capita income is $50,000. This doesn't mean that one country is 5 times better off than the other country, because we go ahead and we make the adjustment according to the PPP, which is the purchasing power. We adjust according to the purchasing power, and that adjustment according to the purchasing power, in essence, really, takes into consideration the amount of labor that is involved. I mean, to give you just a very simple example for those of you who might have not thought about this, let me assume that that one gets a haircut in New York City for $50 and one gets a haircut in, I don't know, Timbuktu for only $2, but that each haircut requires half an hour of labor. So in that case, what you're really saying is that the money in Timbuktu, you require, what did we say, 50 to 1, you would require 1/50th of the money in New York in order to maintain a standard of living in Timbuktu, or other things being equal. And that's why when you use the PPP, in general, we find out that we use the numeraire, the dollar, the US dollar, since it is the single most important economy, the largest economy in the world, and we compare all other currencies to the dollar. And what do we find out? We find out that you've got to adjust the purchasing power of these other currencies upward. We don't depend only on the market. So we say, for example, that a country whose per capita income is only $5,000 a year is equivalent, really, in terms of the PPP, to $25,000 a year. So they don't make only 1/10 of what we make in the United States, but they really make 1/2 of what we make in the United States, and so on and so forth. But that is really nothing else but, again, a labor theory of value. However, right now, we do not really speak of the labor theory of value any longer. And so we find out that in most cases, actually in all cases, whenever we speak about the value of an item, we're really speaking about the price of that particular item. However, I wanted to make sure that you are aware of the controversy and how is it that economists up until now speak about this particular controversy. So it isn't really something that is settled, and probably will not be settled for a long period, for a long time to come, if ever. The other thing that's important in order to be able to speak about value is obviously the notion of scarcity. Again, as a quick reminder to all of you, had it not been for scarcity, then there wouldn't be any need for allocation. And if there is no scarcity and there is no need for allocation, I don't have to worry about economics. Because economics is about what? Nothing else but the idea of allocating scarce resources in order to maximize utility. So if I don't have to worry about scarcity, then I don't have to worry about allocation, therefore there is no need for economics. So we take it for granted that there is such a thing as scarcity and there is such a thing as a market whereby we determine the prices, and that that market is not going to be dependent on the labor theory. So if we are to do this, the next step that becomes important, which is mentioned in the book, is the fact that there is a very popular notion that has become known as the CBA, cost-benefit analysis. So whenever we have to decide on undertaking a particular project, no matter what it is, and in this case, obviously, we're trying to concentrate really on environmental projects. But notice, because of scarcity, we're saying since things are scarce, we cannot go ahead and produce all what we want. There are certain projects that we've got to prefer them to other projects. Why is it that we have to do that? Only because of the notion of scarcity. Otherwise, we'll go ahead and undertake all of these projects. So how do we decide which of these projects we should undertake and which is it that we shouldn't? The most popular tool, obviously, has become that of a CBA, cost-benefit analysis. Whenever I speak about cost-benefit analysis, let me give you just a very, very, very limited background. It isn't really as recent as some people think that it is, because it's really a very simple idea. I'm sure it goes back probably even further than this. But from the things that I have found out, probably one of the most clear-cut mentions of a CBA was done by Benjamin Franklin in the 1770s. He was giving a lecture to a friend about how to decide whether to undertake a particular project or not, and he spoke about getting a blank sheet of paper, drawing a straight line right in the middle, and listing on one side all the benefits, listing on the other side all the costs, and then summing up all the benefits and all the costs in order to decide whether that particular project is going to be worthwhile or not. Then we find out that Dupuy in economics in the 1840s, to be precise, I think around 1844, did almost the same thing in economics when he was talking about bridges and about water. The US Corps of Engineers, when they were talking about, again, the quality of water in the United States in the 1930s, they suggested also the use of something very similar to a CBA. But a CBA became extremely common, very popular, very well known after Ronald Reagan in 1981 issued an executive order whereby he mandated that all federal departments in the United States, whenever they want to execute a project of a substantial size, and it was limited by saying that it's going to be, let's assume, more than a few $1 million, then they've got to do a CBA in order to decide whether that project is going to be feasible or not. As probably some of you know, Ronald Reagan is very well known for his anti-environmental attitudes. He's the one who said that if you've seen a red tree, then you've seen it all. And in this case, the CBA was passed by Ronald Reagan in an attempt to try and really forestall the federal departments from performing very many of the environmental programs, with the hope, because the hope was that the CBA is going to show beyond the shadow of the doubt that these particular projects cannot be justified. It didn't work out that way. A CBA, however, let me add from right now, is very important. It is really essentially a tool. This word is very often forgotten, and I really feel very much that it is very crucial for the understanding of this of the application. It is nothing else but a tool, and it depends on how you use a tool. You find out, as we have been saying, that very many of the environmentalists are opposed to the idea of using a CBA. If for nothing else, but for the simple fact that the use of a CBA is contrary to the belief of those that believe that nature has intrinsic value. If something has an intrinsic value, then you shouldn't be able to go ahead and monetize it. So they don't like the idea of monetizing it. That is obviously one kind of an argument that is very strong. It's been used by philosophers, by environmentalists, by economists, by all sorts of people, environmental economists. However, if you are going to be practical, as I said, all what you have to do is remember what I have just said earlier, that if it is a tool, it depends on how you use that particular tool. Let's just say in this particular case, since I know that I cannot go ahead and undertake all of these environmental projects that I want, I must pick and choose. If I must pick and choose, I need a particular yardstick that will tell me A is preferable to B, or that I shouldn't do A, but I should do C, or whatever it is. And obviously in that case, we find out it's important to have a CBA. Now, whenever you want to undertake any project, whether it's going to be buying a car or going to school or buying a house or whatever, it goes without saying you should always do a CBA. This is say you should think of all the attributes that are going to contribute to your utility, and you should balance these by looking at all the costs that are going to be attributed to that particular decision, and then you decide. If it so happens that the benefits are going to be greater than the cost, then you go ahead and do it. So it's very simple in that case. So the decision rule is not very difficult. There is a decision rule for a CPA that is practically universal. And that is to say you should have a net present value, an NPV, that is positive. That's to say, you take a particular project, it makes no difference how simple or how complicated it is. You go ahead and you find the net present value of all the benefits derived from that particular project, and you compare that to the net present value of the present value of all the benefits of that particular project. If it so happens that the benefits are greater than the cost, then the net present value is going to be positive. And then it tells you that you can go ahead and undertake that particular project. If it so happens that that particular project has a negative present value, then you shouldn't touch it no matter what you believe in. Because it's saying in that particular case that you can take these resources and probably use them in something else that will yield a positive net present value. So because scarcity therefore forces us to think in terms of preferences, in terms of choices. Since we cannot go ahead and accomplish everything, we've got to make a choice, and therefore we've got to do it. But that does not answer the real objection to a CBA. The real objection to a CPA is that Ronald Reagan or the federal government can come up with a particular CBA for a particular project, saying that this project should be undertaken. Why should it be undertaken? Because they found out that the benefits are going to be greater than the costs. But how do we know what are the costs and how do we know what are the benefits? I mean, there is something that is very clear. The out-of-pocket costs are very simple. They shouldn't be very controversial. And most of the important clear benefits should be also rather obvious, and we should go ahead and agree. And then we go ahead and compare them. But what happens very often is that there are very many unseen costs and very many unseen benefits that are not included. So the problem is not with the tool, but it's with the application of the tool. Let me give you a very, very simple example. I know it's a personal one, but yet, since I'm very familiar with it, let me use this example. At one time in the 70s, we wanted to build in the United States a deep water seaport, and we didn't have any in all across the country. And we went down the East Coast, starting from Maine down the line to Houston, and no American port wanted to go ahead and spend the money and the time and the effort in order to build a deep water seaport. So the administration came up with the idea of building it in Puerto Rico. And they did a study, a very detailed CBA, showing that a deep seawater seaport in Puerto Rico, the figures right now are from the top of my head, I don't remember because it was 40 years ago. Let's assume that they showed that the benefit will be $5 billion. So they showed, that is to say, that we should go ahead and undertake that particular project. But then 4 friends of mine and I got together. We were still doing our graduate work, and we decided that this really wasn't, the tool was not applied correctly, because there were very many costs that were not included. So what were the costs that were not included, as you can probably figure out? We thought that the cost of the damage to the marine life was not included, amongst other things. So to make it very simple, let's limit it only to the marine life. So we went ahead and we did a study, and we decided, for example, that the cost, the damage that's going to be done to the marine life is worth $10 billion. And we accepted all the other estimates of the government study. So they showed that they were going to have a net benefit of $5 billion, but that was excluding the damage of $10 billion to the marine life. So in that particular case, if you're going to accept our point of view that there was going to be a damage to the marine life of $10 billion, then all of a sudden this particular project is no longer feasible. And actually what happened, this is definitely a little bit too brief, but it was something very similar to what I have said. We gave the study to the people in Puerto Rico. They went ahead and published it and distributed, and the people in Puerto Rico voted against the project, and the project never really took place. And we think that our study played a very, 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 very important major case in rejecting it. So any project, whether it's going to be accepted or not, depends on what are the items that are going to be included as being a benefit, and what are the items that are going to be included as being a cost. There is, by the way, another very important item, which we referred to last time. We're going to refer to it in a moment later on, but we might as well introduce it right now, is that when you're trying to find out the net present value of an item, it depends on the discount rate. So as you can see, one more time, the important thing that is attached to the discount rate. You can take a big item and bring it down practically to zero by using a very high discount rate. So the assumption of what discount rate is going to be applicable plays also a very important role. But none of these things is really arguing that a CBA should not be used. Actually, in New York City, I didn't want to talk about this, but let me give you another very quick example. At one time, they wanted to build one of the most expensive highways and the most sophisticated highways in the world on the west side. And that was during the latter years of the Carter administration. So that would have been, let's assume, around 1978. And obviously, the mayor of New York City and most of the politicians loved the idea because we were going to build that sophisticated highway to the, at the cost of $1 billion a mile or something like that. However, environmentalists didn't like it. So whether you agree with the environmentalists or not is besides the point. But what they did is that they said part of the items in the cost is going to be the extinction of a particular 2-inch fish. And they went to the court. The judge agreed with the environmentalists, to make a long story short, that yes, it looks like the building of this highway is going to lead to the extinction of that particular 2-inch fish. And how do you value this? Well, he decided that in this particular case, which we're going to deal with later on in the second session, that the valuation of this is going to exceed the benefit from the highway, and so the whole project was decommissioned. So as you can see, it depends one more time, what is it that you include, what is it that you exclude. But what we're going to find out, and we're not going to deal with right now, we're going to deal with later on in the second session, is that even once we decide what to include and what to exclude, then the issue becomes, how do we estimate the value of that particular damage, since there is no market? This is no longer as controversial, as we'll find out later on, because there are right now 3 separate methods that are accepted universally for all practical purposes. None of them will be totally accepted, but they are accepted for all practical purposes as the way to deal with this. Before we go any further, I wanted right now to just show you 2 more things, just to make sure that everybody is aware of this, is that whenever we're talking, obviously since we're talking about supply and demand, if you have a private good, apples, cars, shoes, shirts, whatever it is, and you have John and Jane, and they are the only 2 people in the market, then the demand curve in the market will be the horizontal summation of these. So at this particular price, John demands 5. At this price, Jane demands 6. So at this price, the market demand is going to be for 11. When the good is for free, John demands 6, Jane 7. So the market demand is going to be for 13, and so on and so forth. So you add them this way. So what's the difference between this and between environmental goods? Since most environmental goods, as we have said, are going to be what? Public goods. So in public goods, as you can see, the market vis-a-vis John and Jane will be added vertically and not horizontally. Because we find out in this particular case to have, for example, 1 mile of a highway, John is willing to pay, a particular price, Jane is going to pay another price, therefore for that mile, the market will pay both of these prices, and so on and so on and so on. So it's a completely different way of looking really at the market when you speak about public good, which is true of most environmental assets vis-a-vis a private good. Let me right now go back to the issue of NPV. So what's an NPV? An NPV is the net present value. That's to say, I take the present value of the cost, and I take the present value of the benefit, and I subtract one from the other. It's that simple. What is it that I'm looking for, the decision rule? The decision rule is that the present value of the benefit should exceed the present value of the cost. If the cost is going to be greater than the benefit, then I shouldn't do it. Assuming that we've agreed, obviously, on all the components that should be included under cost and all the components that should be included under benefit. But the issue is, just as another quick reminder, especially for those of you that are not economics or business majors, is that how do we find out the present value? The present value, if you still recall, I remind you of this last time, is very simple. The future value is equal always to the present value into 1 plus the interest rate raised to the power n. N is the number of periods. And very simply, as I said last time, think of it this way. If it so happens that I put in the bank $100 and the interest rate is 10%, what am I going to get at the end of the 1 year? It's going to be 100 into 1 plus 10%, 1 plus 0.01 raised to the power, there is no n in this particular case, so it will be 100 times 1.1, it will be 110. So therefore the present value is nothing else but the future value over 1 plus r raised to the power n. We're going to have to use this, by the way, in the future, but I decided right now to just deal with value. So on week 5, we're going to deal with the issue of allocation over a multiple periods. Remember last week we spoke about allocation over 2 periods. What if we have 4 periods or 5 periods or 10 periods? In that particular case, it's nothing else but an application of this. Now, at the end of this, in the appendix of this chapter, he does show you, or he asks you to go ahead and do this through Excel. I'm not going to be able to go ahead and double check whether you've done Excel correctly or not, but I mean, even whether you do Excel or not, I really I'm not going to be particular about it, but to show you what is it that we're doing. What does Excel do? What you're really talking about in this case, you're saying that this is very similar to finding the present value of a bond. When you buy a bond, what do you do, by the way? You buy a bond that carries a coupon rate. If you buy a bond, in this particular case, I'm assuming that the coupon rate is $10. And let's assume $10 per 100, that is to say, for every $100. So this bond is going to pay you $10 every year for the next, let's assume 50 years. At the end of 50 years, they'll pay you the principal. So when you're going to buy that bond for your college education or future retirement or whatever it is, how do you know how much you've got to pay for it? Well, all what you've got to do is you want to find out the present value of this stream of earnings. That's to say, you find out the present value of the first $10, the present value of the one that's going to be in 2 years, in 3 years, in 4 years. So it's as if you have really nothing else but a stream of present values that you want to find out their present value. So instead of doing a very big stream, because I'm not going to use the Excel, I want you to be able to do this, by the way, by hand. So how do we do it by hand? Let's assume in this case that this bond is going to mature in 3 years. So what are the streams of value if I'm going to get it in 3 years? It means that next year I'm going to get $10. The year after that I'm going to get $10. And the year after that I'm going to get $10. So I'm going to have 3 streams, each of them of $10, and each of them is a year apart, right? And then at the end I'm going to get my $100. So what is it that I'm going to be doing then? What I'm going to be doing is that I'm going to find out the present value of each. The present value of the first $10 is 10 over 1.05. The present value of the second $10 is going to be 10 over 1.05 raised to the power 2. The third is going to be 10 over 1.05 raised to the power 3. And then I'm going to get my $100. This is they're going to pay me back for the bond. So it's going to be 100 over 1.05 raised to the power 3. If you do the calculations for each of these, you'll find out that they're going to add up to 113.616. How do I know that more or less this is an accurate figure, because the coupon of the bond is really paying is 10%, right? The $100 is paying me $10, while I am discounting it at 5, so it means that it must be selling at a premium. But the yield so the price must be then more than 100. Had this been 10%, by the way, then the present value should be 100. And I did it again, and that does turn out to be 99.9999. If the discount rate is 15%, then you'd expect the price to be less than 100. Why? Because always and forever, as you probably know, the price of a bond is inversely related. It's almost a physical law. It is, well, I mean, it isn't physical, but it is almost a physical law, is indirectly related to the interest rate. Whenever the interest rate goes up, the price of a bond goes down. Whenever the interest rate goes down, the price of a bond goes up. And that's why, as you well know, everybody is concerned right now what's going to happen to bonds, to those that have planned on their retirement by buying nothing else but bonds. Because what is it that's happening right now to the interest rates? The interest rates supposedly are going to go up. Now, how much up, we don't know, but let's assume that they're going to go up substantially. So what's going to happen to the price of bonds? The price of bonds are going to go down substantially. So if all your $10 million for retirement is invested 100% in bonds, then the $10 million are going to become, say, for the sake of the argument, $5 million. So people are very much worried about what's going to happen to these particular portfolios that are very heavy in bonds or in fixed interest rate yields. Now, before we call this a session, I want to introduce one other thing, one other term that we're going to use over and over again. At least you'll find out that the book refers to it very often. But in order, again, not to go ahead and construct a diagram that does turn out to be very clear, I have already drawn this on a sheet of paper, and let me show you right now if this shows correctly. Yeah. So what we're going to do right now is that there is a term in trying to find out the price, for, whenever we're trying to find out the value of very many of these assets. And you find out that we use the term the willingness to pay and the willingness to accept. Well, maybe I should mention it right now. I was going to say we'll leave it until next time, but we'll find out that whenever you can, which should be all the time, and trying to use any of these procedures that we're going to talk about in the next session, we will use the willingness to pay and not the willingness to accept. At least in theory. Since we're not going to do any practical matters, it really doesn't make any difference. But you should always spell out the fact that we're going to be using the willingness to pay and not the willingness to accept. Now, what is why? Shouldn't they be the same? And the answer is yes. If you stop to think about it, you will probably say the willingness to accept should be exactly as the willingness to pay. In pure theory, it is. Unfortunately, what has happened in economics, one more time, is that we find out that there's a difference between theory and between real world. Every single study, and I mean practically every single study that has ever been done all over the world, and there are probably, I don't know, thousands, tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of them, has always found out that once you do these studies, you find out that the willingness to accept is greater than the willingness to pay. Uh, I don't want to get into the discussion of why, but very simply, it is really an issue about the substitution between these two goods. I'm using X over here to be the environmental good and this to be wealth. So the substitution between these two goods is not perfect. And since it's not perfect, we'll always find out that the willingness to accept is going to be greater than the willingness to pay. Therefore, whenever we have to do a study, we've got to assume that we're using the willingness to pay. I don't know how many of you have kept up with what I'm saying right now, but let me just give this a quick try over here. If it so happens that you're saying that this and this are over here, and this, and let me assume that we're talking about this and this. So in this particular case, the willingness to accept is equal to the willingness to pay. So this is the willingness to accept, and this is the willingness to pay. In this case, the indifference curves, as you can see, are straight lines and are parallel, which means that you have perfect substitutability. In this case, the indifference curves are not straight and parallel, which are really realistic. The real world indifference curves are like this. Now, I hope that all of you remember something about the indifference curves. All what we're saying, in order to just go through this very quickly, is that this indifference curves measures all sorts of combinations of these two goods that yield the same level of satisfaction. So this society gets satisfaction U sub O whenever it has any of these combinations. If this is, as I said, an environmental asset, so we're saying to have this environmental asset and this wealth will be the same as having this environmental asset and this wealth as having this environmental asset and this wealth. This, any combination on U sub 1, represents a higher level of satisfaction. So the utility up here is higher than the utility up here. And how do we know that? Those of you who again still remember your indifference curves, you're saying that if we have a particular arrow from the origin, the further away we are on that particular arrow, the higher is the level of indifference. So if there is another indifference curve over here, it will be a higher level of satisfaction, a higher level of satisfaction, so on and so forth. So notice what we're saying over here. If it so happens that currently I am at this point, I'm calling it A, right? So I have this combination of this this measure of clean air, and I have this wealth. Now, I don't want this measure of clean air. I want cleaner air. So I want to move from X sub O to X sub 1. If I am to stay at the same level of satisfaction, then I can move from this to this by giving up this much of my wealth. Which means what? This is my willingness to pay. So my willingness to pay is that I am willing to become this much poorer in order to have this much better quality of air. The willingness to accept is exactly the reverse. If I want to have this level of utility, and I want to have this amount of clean air, I'll be willing to settle for this amount of clean air instead of this one, provided you give me more wealth. So I will accept this as a bribe. You can bribe me. You say, okay, accept the clean, the dirty air, but you become richer. While in this case you say, no, I want the cleaner air, and I'm willing to become poorer. Now, these should be identical in a perfect world. But since we don't live in a perfect world, we find out that all studies have indicated that the willingness to accept is greater than the willingness to pay. So whenever we do these studies, these estimates, as we're going to find out later on, we're going to assume that we always use a willingness to pay in order to go ahead and try to estimate the value of the damage or that particular environmental asset. So with this, I will talk to you after a while by doing the